Estimates and revenues. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we are going to get started. We don't want to keep anybody waiting. We're all good. Thank you, Daniel. Daniel, who just got married. Congratulations, Daniel. Now he's mortified. It's great to see all of you. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Board of Revenue Estimates first meeting of FY24. Secretary Grady, welcome back to the Treasury building. And Treasurer Davis, great to have you on our side of the building. You're always welcome. The BRE performs one of the most important roles in state government, forecasting revenues for the state's general fund, which represents about 40% of Maryland's overall revenues, with the other revenues coming from federal fund revenues, also about 40%, and then a combination of transportation revenues, higher ed revenues, and other special funds representing about 20% of our revenues as well. Our work sets the foundation on which the budget of the state of Maryland rests. It informs the work of the governor and the General Assembly, and then ultimately impacts every resident of the state. It's important to mention at the outset of today's meeting that last week, our office issued the FY 2023 closeout report that showed a general fund surplus of $555 million, largely following the BRE forecast in March. And I want to thank our team and the General Accounting Division, as well as the CFOs and finance folks in every agency for working so diligently with us to make sure that we can accomplish that closeout successfully. The closeout report reflected what we discussed at our March BRE meeting, that coming out of the pandemic, Maryland's economy is stable, but experiencing slower growth than was anticipated at this time last year, and slower growth compared to the US economy as a whole, in part due to national inflation, higher interest rates, and the drying up of federal pandemic relief. With the 2023 books now closed, we turn our attention to the 2024 and 2025 forecasts. So before we proceed, do you want to make any opening remarks?
I can save my comments for.
Okay, Mr. Treasurer?
I can wait as well.
Okay. Okay, let's move on to the business at hand. We're here to review the findings and recommendations of the Revenue Monitoring Consensus Group, the RMC, and to vote on their September forecast that includes an updated forecast for FY 2024 revenues. And this is actually our first official forecast for FY 2025 revenues. I'd like to turn the meeting over to our director of the BRE, Robert Lierman, and he's also our executive secretary, to present the report. And before I do that, though, I want to acknowledge the excellent work of Robert, of our deputy director, David Farkas, assistant director, Natalia Medyanets, and the rest of the team. Thank you all. You're an amazing asset, and they are an amazing asset within the Comptroller's office and across state government. So thank you all for your work. And Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And before I start, I must also thank the BRE for powering through also closeout and the September estimates, and as usual, getting past challenges that we present, and also members of the Revenue Monitoring Committee for their invaluable assistance in achieving these consensus estimates, a number of the members who are in attendance today. And with that, I will turn to the proposed board forecast for fiscal 2024. Our revised estimate is $24.57 billion. That is a minor downward adjustment of $14 million. And on a total general fund basis, that's growth of 3.8%. That total general fund amount is being pushed up because in last year there was a one-time transfer of $800 million from the PIT to the Blueprint Fund. So that growth rate is a little higher due to that influence. Turning to our first forecast for 2025, that is $25.08 billion, and that is a growth rate of 2.1%. Now looking to a distilled version of the changes in our forecast, September is the longest duration in between our forecasts. Typically, two factors will drive our changes. The first of which is changes in our economic outlook, and that is largely unchanged from March. We expect these modest growth rates, but we do not think the most likely outcome is a recession. We do think there is an elevated risk and continues to be so, but again, we have modest growth rates and not a recession. The second part that drives changes in our forecast is if the prior fiscal year is significantly different than what we expected. This time last year, we were writing up revenues by over $1 billion as we were riding the tail end of the federal pandemic assistance, which was driving some really unexpected growth. That is not the case this year. As the Comptroller mentioned, our fiscal 23 estimates, or the actuals, were in line with our estimates, and we were modestly under the amount. So when looking at these revenue sources, these are the three largest sources. There's some puts and takes in there, and for the most part, those variances are moving through to fiscal 24. One thing I'll highlight from this slide, there are, in addition to the risk of the recession, as we all know, the impending potential federal shutdown. That is a significant risk, and I will be discussing that at the end of my presentation. Now, on an ongoing basis, in general funds, taking out those one-time distributions, and for our major revenue sources, we do have growth rates that are lower than we think was typical before the pandemic. And I'll be talking about a couple slides and going through that. That's really not an across-the-board pessimism in our economic forecast, because two of our most important revenue sources, withholding and sales and use tax, we actually have growth rates that are a little higher than what we experienced in the pandemic. First, starting with our withholding. In fiscal 23, that exceeded our expectations, and the labor market was resilient, growing at over 5%. And although we do have a deceleration in growth in 24 and 25, it is higher than what the 4% rate that we typically experienced before the pandemic. In a similar manner for our sales tax revenues, the blue bars are our total collections. We forecast that those will grow at a little bit more than 3%. And this is, again, a little higher than what we had in the pandemic, or I should say before the pandemic. This is one of our most sensitive revenue sources to inflation. So most of that we attribute to higher inflation relative to what was occurring before the pandemic. But one of the factors that are driving our lower general fund growth rates, our recent legislation have distributed more revenue to special funds to pay for education, such as in the Blueprint Fund and the sales and use tax. So although gross collections are growing at over 3%, the growth in the general fund is lower due to those higher distributions to special funds. And this is our general fund growth rates for our three most significant revenue sources and for our ongoing general fund revenues. Although we do not have, as I mentioned, across the board pessimism in our forecast, we are cautious on non-wage income. And what gets the most attention there is capital gains, and then also corporate income revenues. For the individual income tax in 24, that low growth rate, that's really reflecting that we are not increasing our expectations for non-wage income. So although our withholding is growing a little bit under 5%, the total growth rate is only 2.7%. And for the corporate income tax, similar to non-wage income, we've had a recent surge in those revenues, and we don't believe that's going to be sustained. We have a cautious outlook on corporate profits. So we forecast total collections will decrease at 2% in each of the next 2 years. But there's also another distribution effect there as well. More money is being distributed to the Transportation Trust Fund. So the general fund decrease is larger than the overall decrease in collections. The last distribution effect I will highlight is our fourth largest revenue source, lottery revenues. And in 2025, they are forecasted to decrease by 17%, most of which is due to increased distributions to pay for bonds for recent projects. And the other factor that is driving down our ongoing general fund growth rate, that 0.9% in 24 and 2.2%, is our other revenue sources beyond the most four important I highlighted are forecasted to decrease because they've also had a recent surge, and we also forecast that these will return to more typical levels. The one that comes to mind and illustrates that the most is our interest income. We received over $300 million in interest income in 23. That's about 10 times what we typically received before we had this increase in interest rates, and also the increase in the state's cash position, I should say. Go ahead, skip to the next slide. Thank you. So our forecast of jobs in Maryland, as I mentioned, was really largely unchanged. With this forecast also shows kind of where we are in the business cycle, where we're headed, what factors are influencing it, and why we may end up with more or fewer jobs than we anticipate. As I mentioned, we do have what we believe is an elevated risk for a recession. We're a couple years removed from this rapid recovery from the pandemic. And until the Federal Reserve reaches its targeted goal of 2% inflation, we're not there yet, or a similar level, and the economy is growing, the national economy is growing at its typical rate, we still maintain that we're going to be in a situation where we have this elevated risk of a recession. So the Federal Reserve has not accomplished their goal, and until they do that, and the economy is growing, we're going to have this elevated risk, unfortunately, to our revenue structure. Now, going forward, as I mentioned, we had this real rapid recovery that was fueled from the federal pandemic assistance. That dynamic was mainly unemployed individuals who had lost their jobs during the contraction, gaining reemployment. We had a doubling of the number of unemployed. That has since normalized. And in fact, our unemployment rate is very low. It's less than 2%. But that only tells part of the story. And then also going forward, in the absence of a recession or other major change, our growth is going to be dependent on our labor supply. And that in turn depends on the share of our population who are employed or looking for employment, and our population growth. And we know since the pandemic, there's been, and not only in our jobs, not only in the economy, I should say, but healthcare, education, it's had profound impacts. And we know there's been changes since that pandemic, and our labor market is seeing those changes as well. So as you can see, this is not a linear growth rate. We do have slowing growth rates because we do anticipate both slowing population growth, and also we have not recovered in terms of our labor force participation, which I'll show on the next slide. This is our labor force participation. This is indexed to the beginning of 2019. We still have a higher labor force participation rate, but unlike the rest of the nation and most of our surrounding states, we have not gotten back to our pre-pandemic level. And not only our surrounding states have gotten back more or less to their level, but Virginia has surpassed it, whereas we remain significantly below where we were before the pandemic. As I mentioned, there's a lot of forces that are driving that. We see a lot of differences by age and also by gender. The second part of this is our population growth. What we're highlighting here is the three factors that drive our population growth. These are the net impacts from each of these three components. We have international migration, domestic migration, and our natural growth rate, births over deaths. The blue bars are international migration. That's been fairly consistent throughout this time period. But when we're looking at our domestic migration, we have typically experienced some out-migration, older retirees going to sunnier climes, but that has changed recently. And that's not just specific to Maryland. The pandemic has caused a dramatic shift in national domestic migration patterns. For the longest time, there was growth to the wealthier states on the coasts, but now what we're seeing is migration to less expensive states. So if you read the District of Columbia just produced analysis, and they bemoan the fact that they're losing population to the Maryland suburbs, which are generally cheaper than the District of Columbia. We're also gaining from states such as New York and New Jersey. However, we in turn are losing residents to less expensive states, such as the Carolinas and Pennsylvania. But what we do not know, and this is the uncertainty as we're in this new economy after the pandemic, is whether this is durable and whether this magnitude will change. So it does introduce some additional uncertainty about our economy. Turning to our kind of natural net increase in population, you notice that has decreased as well. There's several factors driving that. One which I'll highlight is our aging demographic. We continue to become older. But if you also notice, in a lot of these trends, you'll see some of them did appear before the pandemic, and they have become stronger in magnitude, and that is the case with our migration patterns. The last thing I'd like to highlight in this is you do notice when we had some modest domestic in-migration in the early 2000s, that was the last time we experienced that. I think that's probably at least partially attributable to the ramp up in federal spending that occurred post 9/11. So you see, again, one theme of the discussion today will be the great influence that the federal government has on our state. Turning to the personal income tax, this was under our expectations in fiscal 2023. This was driven by a larger than expected decline in final payments, which we attribute to capital gains. We had a significant double-digit decrease over 2 years, and then a continuing decrease. But we think that that it was accelerated into 1 year. But this really highlights the volatility of non-wage income. The orange bars are the general fund contribution to growth in each year and gross collections from non-wage income, and the blue bars are from withholding our wages. So we had a tremendous swing from 22 to 23, and that on a tax year basis, from 21 to 22, that was the greatest 2-year volatility we experienced in the last 45 years. And the last I will point out on this chart, the last point, is you can see that a little bit of that drag on our personal income tax total collections I highlighted. There's no increase in our non-wage income, so it's keeping that first year, that 2024 total personal income tax growth rate lower than it is in 25. And highlighting just the continued risk of non-wage income, if there is a silver lining from having less revenue than you expected, it's that it was from a volatile source. We believe we peaked in fiscal 22, where $1 in $5 were being contributed to the general fund from these volatile sources. And since we had this greater than expected decline, we think we de-risked earlier than we anticipated last year. However, as you can see, we're still above our 10-year average. So although the risk we believe is less than we were than last year, we're still at an elevated risk from this volatile source. And it will always be a persistent risk to our forecast given the difficulty in forecasting this revenue source. And next few slides, I'll touch on the significant risk of this potential impending shutdown in the federal government. And the impact will very much depend on the type of shutdown, its duration, and if there's significant spending cuts as part of any agreement to end the shutdown. We've had 3 recent shutdowns or significant budget actions. We had 2 short duration shutdowns that, although very stressful for federal employees, did not have a significant impact on the Maryland economy or our revenue structure because of their short duration. However, as an example of the risk factor is what occurred in 2013 with the federal budget sequestration. This did have a significant long-tailed impact on our economy. Our economy did not grow for several years, whereas the national economy grew over that time, and our wage growth was slow over this period as well. Also, like to highlight as well, though, no matter what happens in the short term, long term, we have lower expectations of growth from the federal government as there's this yawning imbalance between expenditures and revenues, which we believe at some point will have to be addressed. This chart highlights some of the risk of a federal government shutdown and how, on the one hand, Maryland is a tremendous asset to the federal government as our skilled workforce and our economy provides for the goods and services that are crucial for the federal government. But we in turn do receive a lot of income from the federal government. Tip of the hat to Chief Deputy Comptroller Andy Schaufel, who put together this query so we can present this for the first time. This is the percent of federal adjusted gross income for residents by county. This includes both retirement and wages, but it does not include contractors or members of the intelligence community. So it may underestimate a little bit. We do not have that data. When you're looking at the share, roughly 75% of this is wages, with the remaining amount from retirement income. And looking at the state, Prince George's County, Southern Maryland, as you expect, have these high shares of income from the federal government due to the presence of military installations in those counties and also proximity to the District of Columbia. One thing to note as well, not only are there differences in the shares in income, the Eastern Shore, as you can see, is lower, but there's also differences in the dependence on wage income versus retirement income. So the Eastern Shore, not only do they have a lower share of total income from the federal government, but they're more reliant on retirement income than wages. Now, turning to some of the impacts that we saw from sequestration, this is our withholding income tax revenue and the 6-month moving average. And as you can see, there's that depressed growth rates that occurred not too long after sequestration and continued from some time. And then we do believe that, and that was a major factor from that, or driving that, was sequestration. And we did have that low wage growth for some time after sequestration. As I mentioned, we do not have federal contracting data, but to highlight the potential impact, an additional vector that would impact our economy. These are federal government contracts that are primarily performed in Maryland. And as you can see, after sequestration, there was a dip in the amount of contracts that were performed in Maryland, and it took a number of years for it to recover to a similar level. That's, again, showing additional risk factor if there is a dramatic slowing of federal spending. So in summary, this forecast is only a minor adjustment, and we are largely consistent with our forecast. It calls for these modest growth rates, but not a recession. But unfortunately, we are still in a situation where we do have these elevated risks, not only from recession, but from this potential federal government shutdown. And as always, we will continue to monitor these developments closely. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert, for the presentation. we could see a slowdown in state tax receipts and reduced economic activity statewide as well. In tax year 2021, 1 in 9 individual income tax filers were either federal workers or retirees, and 352,000 Maryland households directly benefited from either wages or retirement income from the federal government, with a total income of $31 billion, or 10.5% of all income earned in Maryland. More than 152,000 federal jobs are based in Maryland, representing 4.1% of all jobs. So Maryland has successfully weathered several financial storms in the past few years. And I know that now with savvy investments, prudent financial planning, and a more clear picture of the challenges that we continue to face, we can be and will be well positioned to navigate this post-pandemic economy moving forward, in large part due to the work of our team at the BRE and the great partners we have in state government who are thinking and deeply about how to make sure that we are investing for the long term. So with that, I would love to turn it over to the Secretary and the Treasurer for comments before we vote on the September forecast revisions. Sure.
Please.
Thank you, Comptroller Lierman, and special thank you to Robert and the revenue estimating staff thank you for their diligent work on the modeling that supports this updated revenue forecast. I've learned a lot working with the team these past 9 months and really appreciate this process. To put today's forecast in context of budget planning, the forecast makes the structural deficit a little worse than projected by DLS over the summer. As that Robert explained and the Comptroller reiterated, total current year general fund revenues are projected to grow less than 1% in fiscal year 24 and slightly more than 2% in fiscal year 25. And this is after only 1.7% growth last year in fiscal 23. These low growth rates do not keep pace with growth in expenditures, hence the structural deficit that we face. The administration has been clear from day one that the factors that drove our state's cash surplus by the fall of 2022, this time last year, like many states around the country, were external to Maryland and would not be sustained. It's why the administration made fiscally responsible choices in our first budget by maintaining a significant fund balance, directing $1 billion of the cash towards core investments in education and transportation funding, while maintaining 10% of revenue in the rainy day fund. This revised forecast doesn't change anything with regard to our current budget planning. Since the beginning, the administration has been preparing for potential economic headwinds, and we continue to prepare for every potential revenue outcome. The administration will continue to focus on protecting the interests of our state and ensure we're on firm financial footing as we roll out our agenda. As we prepare to introduce our next budget for fiscal year 2025 come January, the administration's work is cut out for us. We will continue to be selective, disciplined, and intentional with our investment decisions. We will scrutinize how state operating and capital dollars are directed with an eye for prioritizing funds toward the state's primary responsibilities and the key outcomes that align with our agenda, including first and foremost investments in economic growth to strengthen the tax base and impact these projections in the years ahead. We look forward to continuing our strong partnership, Comptroller's Office, Treasurer's Office, and of course, our colleagues in the General Assembly as we embark on this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Treasurer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank my colleagues, Comptroller Lierman, Secretary Grady, on just closing out the fiscal year with a $550 million surplus. I'd like to thank the Bureau of Revenue Estimates and staff and other members of the Revenue Monitoring Committee for their help in developing this estimate. Today's news paint a relatively unchanged picture since our last meeting in March. As treasurer, I will always err on the side of caution when dealing with taxpayer monies. Our economy is stable now. However, it remains uncertain. As I've said before, Maryland is not recession-proof. we must continue to proceed with a degree of caution moving forward. As of today, the state of Maryland has a $21 billion portfolio. We have roughly $5 billion cash on hand, $3 billion in our rainy day fund. Our challenge moving forward remains the same. Manage the budget while continuing to make critical investments to support Maryland and our economy. I continue to believe that Maryland will do as it has always done, rise to the challenge. I am confident that the governor and the General Assembly will continue to work together in the best interests of our citizens. Thank you. All of that being said, we simply cannot ignore what is happening with the federal government. I do not know how many times we're going to have to keep reliving this national nightmare. In 1980 and 1981, we had one-day shutdowns. In 1984 and 1986, we had 4-hour shutdown each year. In 1990, we had a 3-day shutdown. In 1995, we had a 5-day shutdown. From December 1995 to January of 96, we had a 21-day shutdown. In 2013, we had a 16-day shutdown. In 2018, we had a 3-day shutdown. And from December of 2018 until January of 2019, we had a 35-day shutdown. And today we have the federal government notifying workers of an imminent shutdown. While we have so-called leaders playing some foolish game of chicken to impress the bases, Marylanders and citizens across the country are facing the very real possibility of losing their ability to pay the mortgage, buy food, purchase needed medications, have access to programs like Head Start, childcare, nutritional services like Meals on Wheels, housing choice vouchers, etc. While those in Washington may not give a damn, the people who benefit from these programs, the American people, certainly do. They do not deserve to have their economic safety nets needlessly pulled from beneath them. To the members of Congress, this isn't really difficult. As I see it, you have 3 options: lead, follow, or get out of the way. Finally, I say to my fellow American citizens, we're culpable in this as well. As Thomas Jefferson famously said, the government you elect is the government you deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. And so with that, do I have a motion to adopt the September forecast revisions?
Second.
And they are adopted.
I'm used to you making the motion.
I know, I usually make the motion, sorry, yes, in the other meetings, yes. Well, and with that, they are adopted. Thank you so much, Robert, to the whole BRE team, to the treasurer's team and the DBM team, and to all of you for joining, and onwards. Thank you.